Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ask a Theologian, the Catholic University of America, School of Theology and Religious Studies podcast. My name is Will Dethridge. I am a master's student in historical and systematic theology, and joining me today is Dr. Robert Miller, Associate Dean of the Graduate School, as well as a professor who specializes in early Israel. It's great to have you, sir.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, one of the questions that we like to start off asking our professors who come on this show is if you could describe your journey towards, becoming a professor. As you might know, it's a popular path for many theology students. They might be interested in getting their master's, if not PhD, or really continuing their learning journey. So if you could describe yours, that would be most helpful for listeners.
It's sort of through the back door. So I did my undergraduate in archaeology, and intended to do archaeology and be an archaeologist at first. And it was only after spending some time, even in graduate school, intending to be an archaeologist, that I realized I was more interested in the meaning of it all and the implications of what I was finding. I did my PhD at the University of Michigan, which it may seem, how could you possibly have a Bible program at the University of Michigan? But University of Michigan actually had and still has, to an extent, a really old and respected program, especially in Old Testament. So all of anything that had the name Anchor Bible commentaries, Anchor Bible dictionary, all of that was done out of the University of Michigan in the 20th century. It's through Yale now. But I did my master's there, and then I came here for a year, and then I went back and did the PhD at Michigan. And when I was here, I did a lot of the sort of hermeneutics, theology, biblical theology. I did a little bit of biblical studies here as well, but I really wanted to focus that year on how do we bring the interpretation to theological relevance. And then I went back and finished the real sort of hardcore philological work at Michigan again. But when I was, 19 or 20, I thought I would just wanted to be Indiana Jones.
Wow, no, that's great. And, I've read, in your biography that you're also a secular Franciscan. Is that right?
Yes, I have been. Both my wife and I are been professed since 1998, so quite a long time. The secular Franciscans, or the Third Order Franciscans, have been a branch of the Franciscan family going all the way back to Francis of Assisi himself, who wanted a way that lay people living in the world could continue to follow him in following Christ.
No, that's wonderful. One of the themes that have really come up on this podcast is how many of our professors are very active in their faith lives, not just approaching theology as an academic discipline, but as a way of life, essentially. So I think that's something very special that Catholic U has to offer, and it's good to hear that our associate deans ascribe to that mentality as well. Well, diving into a few of the areas of research, we're going to start off with some questions from students. Anthony Dryden, one of our students here at Catholic U, he wants to know about how other cultures have influenced early Israel, since that's your primary field of research, and conversely, how Israel influenced other earlier cultures. I know that in the Bible, there's often this dichotomy presented where it's Israel versus the world, it seems.
Yeah.
And a lot of research has shown that that's likely the product of many redactions and revisions, and that early Israel actually had a lot of contact and emerged from other cultures. So if you could describe how that happened, or the relationship between Israel and its neighboring cultures, that would be great.
Yeah, and it really, we should have seen this already in the biblical text. I think about when Solomon is going to build the temple, he hires architects from Syria or Phoenicia, and they come down and they build a perfectly good Phoenician temple. There's no Israelite architect. There's no Israelite design. The entire setup of the temple, according to the Bible itself, is Phoenician, and it looks just like the temples in Phoenicia. So I think we shouldn't have been surprised to know that Israel borrows from their neighbors, and not only when it's bad. I mean, everybody knew that, and that, Jeremiah and Ezekiel and everybody else was denouncing them for foreign gods. But there were a lot of things that they did that were, perfectly acceptable. And I mean, it's really, I think, the borrowing in the field of religion that really people are more interested in. I mean, whether they borrowed metallurgy and so forth, nobody cares. But it's when we say, oh, did they borrow elements of the religion? And so we see, for example, rituals or feasts in the Canaanite calendar that look just like the Feast of Booths in the Jewish calendar. Well, is this controversial? And to me, it not only is it not controversial, but it really it's exactly what the church has been doing for the last 2,000 years. I mean, when Jehovah Witnesses come to my house in December and say your Christmas tree is a pagan symbol. Well, yeah, you're right. It was originally, and like many other things, the church has baptized it, and now it has all sorts of Christian symbolism. But this is exactly what the Israelite religion was already doing. And some of it is architecture, some of it is rituals, like the Feast of Booths is just the example I can think of it. Some of it is metaphors, so images. This is what I've done a lot of work on, images used for God, to describe God. You get these passages in like the Psalms or Isaiah 51, Isaiah 27, where God, you slew the primeval dragon. And you're like, what in the world is this? Well, this is a metaphor to just say that God is our strength against evil. But it's a metaphor that they borrowed from their neighbors, just as we borrow metaphors that we use for Christ, for Our Lady, from other cultures, and then we use them to mean something theological in our own context. What nobody's done much work on is Israel's influence on other peoples. And this is something I wish we could dive into, because we sort of have this idea that, well, the Jews were not evangelistic, and by and large that was true. They weren't trying to convert other people. But already in the late chapters of Isaiah, you get this idea of being a light to the nations. It's there in a lot of the Psalms. There's this idea that all the nations will look at what God's done for Israel and come to worship God. So did it work? And I think people have just not even asked this question. We're really interested in every period. Oh, did the Persian religion influence Judaism? All these different things. Well, what about the other way around? And to be honest, I can't think of anything I've ever read where scholars have tried to unpack this.
Interesting.
I mean, you did get this hundreds of years ago. There were church fathers who thought that certain Greek philosophers must have spoken to Jews and learned from them. And there's even a rabbinic story about a rabbi teaching Aristotle. But no modern scholar has looked at this, and I think this is something we ought to be looking at.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that there's some more work out there in the field. So, for those who are interested in this topic, that could be a future dissertation right there. That's fascinating. And yeah, definitely appreciate, I come from a Mexican-American background. So, seeing how our culture has really infused a lot of, quote, pagan elements, injected a lot of Christianity into them, Christianized them like that, and, keep the beauty of all these great ways of expressing our culture while doing it in a Christian fashion. I think it's just a beautiful part of the universality of Catholicism. And it's great to hear that it has its roots all the way back in our Israelite ancestors.
And the church fathers were explicit that this is not just a strategy, that God has actually planted the semina verba, the seeds of the word, in every culture, so that they could be brought in this way.
No, that's absolutely beautiful. Well, you mentioned your background in archaeology, and one of the students who submitted questions picked up on that, and he was wondering what some of the more significant archaeological discoveries or anthropological studies on early Israel. If you could detail some of those, like what's going on in the field right now? What are the major findings, debates, or discussions going on right now? That's from John Tuttle from Benedictine College, actually.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm glad he said anthropological, because really what gets the PR is not, to me, what's the most interesting. So, I mean, last week they found an inscription that has the name Jerubbaal, which is the other name of Gideon on it.
Oh, wow.
It's not the Gideon. I mean, it's in the wrong part of the country. But everybody latches, oh, wow, have we found the proof that this person existed? And even among scholars, I mean, the big area of debate now is still on issues of historicity. And right now, it's the historicity of the United Monarchy of David and Solomon.
Right.
And to me, these issues are really not the most interesting. And having archaeology answer for you a yes or no question, to me, is much less than what it's capable of doing. And especially, the person asked about anthropology. The anthropological questions you can ask through archaeology, to me, are much more interesting in terms of, let's say, literacy. And there's a lot of discoveries being made in terms of how early is their literacy in Israel, and then even beyond that, what is actually put down in writing? Because I mean, for me, and I've written a lot about orality and literacy as well. By the time Israel goes into exile in the Babylonian exile in 586 BC, you have a lot of writing. You have letters. You have lots of economic documents. You have not one single piece of literature. And to me, I think we've misunderstood the question of literacy and tried to say, well, when do they stop being oral tradition and start being literate? And in fact, they have literacy for them is about economics. It's about letters. It's about rapid communication. If you're going to write literature, like say the book of Amos, you're not going to actually write that. That's going to be handed down orally from teacher to disciple. And then you can start looking at anthropology of how societies that are both literate and oral at the same time work. And you can look at that throughout the world. And you could do this in any other number of issues with regard to, let's say, social status and what the prophets say about the treatment of the poor, to not just sort of simply assume this is the same as a market economy and you could just cut and paste from Amos and apply it to the modern political situation. Use anthropology, apply it to what archaeology tells you about the ancient economy, and then you can actually understand, oh, here's what the prophets are critiquing. And then you can be a little more sophisticated with your homily about how to apply it today.
Great. And you mentioned a couple on the archaeology end of things, that historicity is up for debate in a few circles. But, in the fields of anthropology, say somebody wants to get into biblical anthropology, or even Old Testament studies in general, what do you see as the predominant issues or topics that are really swirling around, or at least what do you think we should be focusing on right now? Just for people who are interested in diving into the field.
There's still so much that's never been excavated. And so, I mean, there's still the really old kinds of questions of, can I find the royal archives of the Northern Kingdom of Israel? Well, we've not even successfully enough dug the sites to know. But what I don't want is to just get bogged down in the names and the dates so this is something I've done all the way back to my own dissertation, was looking at regional archaeology and trying to understand the ancient society. What was farming like? What was interpersonal relations like? What were the relations between male and female, gender roles like? Those are the things that archaeology is really good at, except that in ancient Israel, archaeologists have tended to get pretty stuck on, oh, this is from the year 1000 BC. No, it's from the year 900 BC, and let's fight about that and argue in publication. And really silly questions like that.
Well, I certainly appreciate that perspective, because certainly, as a young Catholic, I've seen and I've heard a lot of people cling on to the historicity or precision of historical events detailed in the Bible. And one thing that comes up a lot more, especially in more modern biblical studies, is this notion that a lot of events described in the Bible might be classified more as legendary or even mythological. And I see a lot of young Catholics, they get repelled by this notion of myth. I think as a negative connotation to it. Could you explain, how our understanding of a myth or legend should be formed if it is as negative as a lot of people who shy away from that, especially on the fundamentalist end of things, would say, and if that's always been the case, like how our perception of myth has changed over time and what it should be?
Yeah, and I really think there's sort of two issues here. There's the issue of historicity, and what I tell students, if you had like a sort of a spectrum, and on one side is St. Peter, and I'm 100% sure that he existed and that he probably did exactly what it says he did. And on the other end is the prodigal son, and I'm pretty sure there's no such person.
Right.
It's just a story Jesus invented.
Yep.
Okay, where in the middle is Abraham? Okay,
right.
he's towards the historical side, but I couldn't even tell you what century to look in.
Right.
David is a little more on the historical side. Noah is a little more on the legendary side. Yep. And then I get somebody like, let's say, Job. And even you look at what Aquinas writes about Job, and he says, I don't know if this is a real person or not. And in the end, it doesn't make any difference.
Yep.
He said, this whole story could be a parable or it could be real. And he says, that doesn't matter for what it means.
Right.
So the church fathers as well, John Chrysostom says this also about both Job and Jonah. He says, these might not be real people. These might be just parables. And it doesn't matter, because the point is not whether Jonah comes to believe and that Nineveh is worth saving or not. As the VeggieTales movie says, it doesn't matter whether Jonah believes, it matters whether you believe. So the point of the story isn't about the guy, it's about you. Yeah. So there's that, and where I don't think we need to be afraid to put people in the middle of that spectrum and to say we don't know where they are. And even someone like David or Solomon, which I'm pretty sure these are real people, did they do everything it exactly says they did? Well, first question is, well, what it says he did in Chronicles is not what it says he did in 2 Samuel. So let's get that right. But then there's the other issue of myth. And as a genre, I think there are texts that for years I didn't like to call them this. Like, let's say, the story of Adam and Eve, or the story of the flood. And for years I didn't want, I wanted to call it something other than myth, because that word has a negative context.
Yes.
Both for us and even the way it's used in the New Testament. Paul says we don't believe in silly myths. But what really changed my mind was reading John Paul II use the term myth. And he uses the term myth to talk about the story of Adam and Eve in his Theology of the Body. And he defines myth. And he says myth means describing in terms of the world that which is beyond the world.
I love it.
And that's exactly what this is. So the story of the creation of Adam describes in terms of God gathers the dust of the earth and breathes into the breath of life, but it means a human being is both material and spiritual. Israel would have no way to say that. They don't write philosophy. but they do, and they describe in terms of the world what's beyond the world. Man names all the animals. That means all of the animals, man has dominion over them.
Right.
It doesn't mean man named the animals. I mean,
Yep.
and I don't think it ever did. I don't think that it's like a story the Israelites, quote, believed that now
Right.
we read as myth. I think this is always meant symbolically, and you see that when you look at other myths of the ancient world, the
Yes.
Egyptian myths, the Babylonian myths. This is their philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It's different philosophy. Their philosophy tells you and the king are different species, and you're designed to serve him.
Yeah.
But again, it doesn't. It always has this mythical meaning. It always
Yep.
describes in terms of the world what's beyond the world.
Yep.
Now, what texts belong to myth and what don't? That's then when you get into this question. I'm pretty sure that Genesis 1 through 11, that's what I'm going to call this myth. And then something really changes between 11 and 12. There's a huge difference. And I mean, even Pius XII in Humani Generis says the genre of 1 through 11 is not the same as the genre of the rest of the Old Testament.
Right.
So outside of Genesis, well, again, in the Psalms where God slays the dragon on the waters, that's myth. But and we're used to it in the Psalms. I mean, the Lord is my shepherd. We pretty much know he's not really a guy with sheep.
Yeah.
But then where else is there myth? And that's then when you get into sometimes controversial arguments.
Of course. No, I really appreciate that perspective. You know, even more recent cultures, relatively, when you look at the Greeks and the Romans, and you hear a lot of their foundational myths, and especially that of the Romans. And, you know, you think that a lot of them wouldn't have taken them, you know, literally or historically, yet they retain so much meaning. I mean, even in our American context, there's a lot of myths about the founding fathers. I mean, you hear all the time about George Washington and that cherry tree, and there's no historical basis for that, yet it gives meaning to who he was and what our culture is about. And to the way I always think about it is that if people can construct myths or narratives to really encapsulate what their culture was about, there's no reason that God couldn't play a process in crafting the myths or legends that form. I mean, people forget that these are oral traditions, and how do you remember things? You remember them through stories. The stories conceal the morals and the meanings like that. So I think
and I think that's important analogy too for the I guess I don't want to call them myths, but the things where there's a kernel of history, but it's not really what you see. I mean, and this comes up, let's say, with the Exodus.
Yes.
It's really unlikely that all of the ancient Jews were descendant of people who came out of Egypt. I think that there's a portion of their population that goes back to that. But I always ask students, you know, in early November, how many of you are descendants of people who were on the Mayflower? And nobody raises their hand. And I say, oh, so none of you are going to eat turkey, are you? Well, no, of course we are. Well, why? Because it's our myth. But it is historical.
Yeah.
But it isn't really all of our ancestry. But we've decided this is the narrative that's foundational for all of us, even whose ancestors only came here 100 years ago. And I think that probably is what happened with the Exodus as well. This is not the experience of 100% of their ancestry, but it's the only experience that matters.
Yeah, well, I love that analogy for sure. I think that's very, very helpful in our American context. And we've brought up a few topics that are rather difficult for people to grasp, if not challenging or daunting, because you know, I think it makes people uncomfortable to, you know, challenge the way we grew up knowing things. And Mary Bonino, another Catholic U student, asks, well, what are some of the most difficult topics you've had to teach as well as research throughout your career?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's been, in terms of teaching, there have been times where it is Genesis, and I've done a lot of work on how science relates to faith, and not that there are a lot of Catholic young Earth creationists. But it's more the issue. I mean, I think a lot of Catholics compartmentalize, and I believe Genesis, and then separately I believe in evolution, and I haven't the slightest idea how the two relate to each other. They don't. I think about them at different times of the week, and to me, that's where it's more helpful to see, well, what is the truth that it's trying to present? Because I don't want people to think, well, the Bible's only true in certain places. That's not true. The Bible, in Catholic belief, the entire text is inerrant, but it's inerrant as it pertains to our salvation. So what's the salvific truth in Genesis 2 and 3? And it's also one of the ways that I found it's most helpful is to find, that the church has never really had a fundamentalist way of reading the text. So really to bring out the church fathers, who Catholic tradition holds that these are the prime interpreters of Scripture. So when it comes to Scripture, it's not Aquinas, it's the church fathers. And I mean, Augustine, for example, he says, to think that God molded dirt with his hands is a childish idea, and obviously not what the Holy Spirit means. And so nobody's taking this literally. You have other church fathers that would say, well, and the other interesting thing is the church fathers really tried to use the science of their day. So I'm thinking like Basil the Great, he writes this commentary on Genesis 1, and he says, we all know from science that creation happened instantaneously in one moment. God wrote it as if it were 7 days. Now, we would say, well, your science is a bit batty, but he's not going to let his understanding of the text he doesn't let a fundamentalist reading of Genesis 1 override what he thinks is science. And so he tries to explain what the 6 days do mean. And there he actually makes a whole lot of sense of what the 6 days do mean. They don't mean 6 24-hour periods over which God created things, because he's not going to let he knows Aristotle and Galen tell him science. The Bible tells him a different level of reality. It tells him the philosophical truths. So it's always been very helpful to me to pull out the church fathers, Augustine, the Eastern fathers, and I really love the church fathers when it comes to these texts.
No, they're definitely not studied enough, in my opinion. I think especially since Vatican II, there has been a greater emphasis put on them for sure, but still a little bit of a ways to go to really integrate them into all forms of theological study. I don't meet enough young Catholics who dive into them as much, especially from Western traditions, I think.
And with my own research, I don't think I've ever had anything that I've thought, well, I hope this doesn't challenge someone's faith. I mean, that's never. It's always, for me, it's the opposite. That I've had moments of great awe when I've made some discovery. Not that I've made this huge discovery, but that God is much bigger than I thought he was. That sort of thing. I mean, I've repeatedly in libraries had that sort of feeling like Roy Scheider in Jaws, where he says you're going to need a bigger boat, and I realize I'm going to need a bigger God.
Nice. Well, along those lines, just to close things off, could you detail a few of those key moments in your life or career, either those key discoveries or realizations that really changed or challenged the way that you approach biblical studies or even your faith?
Yeah, I mean, and it goes back to one we've talked about before, which is this myth idea. And in this book I wrote on that's called the Dragon, the Mountain, and the Nations, which is about this metaphor in the Old Testament, which of course comes up in the New as well. I mean, I always take students over to the National Shrine to see the image on the ceiling of the seven-headed dragon confronting Mary. So biblical scholars have known that image in Revelation 12 comes from the Old Testament, and the image in the Old Testament comes from the Canaanites. One or two biblical scholars had written that, it seems the Canaanites may have borrowed this from other people. And when I was writing this book, I thought, I want to trace this in both directions. So I talk about how this image is picked up in the New Testament and even in early baptismal formulas and so forth. But I also kept going back, and I kept going back, and I kept going back, and I was finding this was taking me back to like the 7th millennium BC. I
Wow.
mean, and that's the moment I was thinking, God, from my perspective, these semina verba were planted at a very early time.
Yeah.
That long before Israel, long before any Abraham, you've already got metaphors that are going to be essential for the way Scripture articulates something about God it couldn't say any other way. And they're already here this far back. And to me, that's not a challenge of faith. That's a moment of, wow, look at this preparatio evangelii, the preparation for the gospel, and just how far back it goes. That's to me the things that I just couldn't wait to then get down in print.
No, that's beautiful. And I think that's a great way to close off our conversation. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.